Sometimes the hardest fall isn't from success to failure. It's from being somebody to being nobody. 50-year-old Evan Pike knows this better than most, raising his daughter alone while mopping floors at the Grand Belmont Hotel, invisible to the wealthy guests who pass through its marble halls. When billionaire Lance Caraway throws hot coffee in his face during a conference, the crowd laughs as Evan walks away in silence. But minutes later, a market crash wipes out Lance's billion-dollar empire. His assets freeze, his reputation crumbles, and he's escorted out the back door where Evan still stands with his mop. Lance recognizes the janitor he just humiliated and learns a stunning truth. Evan once worked as a brilliant analyst until Lance's company destroyed his career years ago. What will happen when these two men face each other again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's harsh buzz cut through the pre-dawn darkness at 4:30 in the morning, the same as it had every workday for the past 7 years. Evan Pike's hand found the button by muscle memory, silencing the sound before it could wake Bridget in the next room. At 50 years old, his body protested the early hour more than it used to, joints stiff as he swung his legs out of bed and sat for a moment in the quiet. The apartment was small, just 2 bedrooms in a building that had seen better decades, but it was clean and it was theirs. Evan moved through his morning routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to make every minute count. Shower, shave, coffee brewing, while he dressed in the navy blue maintenance uniform with Grand Belmont Hotel embroidered over the pocket. The fabric was worn soft from countless washings, and there was a small stain near the hem that never quite came out, a reminder of a bleach spill from 2 years back. He stood at the kitchen counter, drinking his coffee black and strong, looking at the framed photograph on the wall. Patricia smiled out at him, holding newborn Bridget, her eyes bright with joy and exhaustion. The photo was 23 years old now, but Evan still said good morning to it every day. Patricia had been gone for 5 years, and the missing her had settled into something he carried like an old scar, always there, but no longer sharp enough to stop him from moving forward. On the small dining table sat evidence of Bridget's late-night study session, textbooks on social policy, a laptop with sticky notes covering its edges, empty tea mugs clustered near a stack of papers. His daughter was finishing her graduate degree in public administration, working toward something that mattered to her, helping people navigate systems that often seemed designed to keep them down. Evan felt a swell of pride every time he thought about it. She'd gotten her determination from Patricia and her sense of justice from both of them. He left a note on the counter, leftover chicken in the fridge. "Love you, Dad," and headed out into the cold morning air. The bus ride to the Grand Belmont took 40 minutes, winding through neighborhoods that shifted from working-class apartment complexes to tree-lined streets with restored brownstones, and finally to the glittering downtown corridor where the hotel rose like a cathedral to wealth. Evan watched the city wake up through the window, thinking about how he used to make this same journey in reverse, back when he wore suits instead of maintenance uniforms. 12 years ago, he'd been a senior data analyst at DataCore Solutions, a mid-sized firm that specialized in financial risk assessment. He'd been good at his work, better than good. He could see patterns in numbers that others missed, could build predictive models that saved clients millions. He'd had an office with a window, a salary that let Patricia stay home during her illness, and a pension that promised security. Then came the acquisition. Pinnacle Data Solutions, a name that meant nothing to him at the time, bought DataCore in what the business press called a strategic consolidation. What it really meant was that a larger predator had swallowed a smaller fish, extracted what it wanted and spit out the rest. Evan's entire department had been eliminated within 6 months. At 43, with a wife fighting cancer and a daughter in college, he'd suddenly found himself competing for jobs with people half his age who would work for half his former salary. The unemployment had stretched for 14 months. Their savings evaporated. The house went into foreclosure. Patricia's medical bills mounted, and the insurance from his old job ran out. By the time he finally found work, janitorial services at a downtown office building, they'd lost almost everything except each other. Evan shook off the memories as the bus pulled up to the Grand Belmont service entrance. Some things you couldn't change, only accept and move forward from. The Grand Belmont had been built in the 1920s, all Art Deco elegance and old money discretion. The guest areas gleamed with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted. The service areas, where Evan spent his days, were different. Concrete floors, fluorescent lighting, the mechanical hum of industrial laundry and kitchen exhaust systems. Two worlds existing in the same building, carefully separated. Antonio Reyes, head of maintenance, was already in the break room when Evan arrived, pouring coffee from the ancient machine that somehow kept running despite all logic. At 58, Antonio had worked at the Grand Belmont for 33 years, starting as a night porter and working his way up. His face was weathered, his hands calloused, but his eyes were kind. "Morning, Evan," Antonio said, handing him a cup. "Big day today. Global Economic Summit starts this morning. Hotels fully booked with VIPs and their people. More work for us," Evan said with a slight smile. "Always is." Antonio checked the assignment board. "Got you on executive floors today, 6th through 9th. Conference rooms need to be spotless before the morning sessions." Phyllis Washington pushed through the door, still pinning her name tag to her hotel manager's blazer. At 52, she'd been at the Grand Belmont almost as long as Antonio, and she ran the night shift with firm efficiency tempered by genuine care for her staff. "Morning, gentlemen," she said, grabbing her own coffee. "Fair warning, we've got some high-maintenance guests in this week. Caraway Capital has the entire 8th floor. Lance Caraway himself is in the presidential suite." Evan had heard the name before, seen it in financial news. Caraway Capital was one of those massive investment firms that moved markets with their decisions. Lance Caraway had the reputation of being brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely certain of his own importance. "We've already had 3 complaints from his assistant about thread counts and water pressure," Phyllis continued, rolling her eyes. "Just stay professional and stay out of their way. These types don't like to remember the help exists." Evan nodded. He was used to being invisible. In some ways, it made the work easier. You could move through spaces without the complicated dance of social interaction, without having to pretend you had anything in common with people who spent more on a single meal than you made in a week. He gathered his supplies, cleaning carts stocked with microfiber cloths, glass cleaner, floor polish, fresh linens, and headed for the service elevator. The hotel was waking up around him. Kitchen staff prepping breakfast, front desk changing shifts, bellhops positioning themselves for the first guests to emerge from their rooms. The executive floors were quiet at this hour, thick carpeting muffling all sound. Evan moved methodically from room to room, checking conference spaces, restocking supplies, ensuring everything met the Grand Belmont's exacting standards. The work was repetitive, but he'd learned to take pride in it. There was dignity in any honest labor, Patricia used to say, and he'd come to believe she was right. Through tall windows, morning sun illuminated the city skyline. Down in the hotel's grand ballroom, the economic summit would soon begin. Powerful people making decisions that would affect millions of lives, discussing markets and policies and the abstract mathematics of wealth. Evan understood that world better than any of them would guess. He'd once sat in rooms like that, spoken that same language of data and projections. Now he cleaned those rooms instead. The irony wasn't lost on him, but he'd learned not to dwell on bitterness. That way led nowhere good. His phone buzzed with a text from Bridget. "Good luck today, Dad. Love you." He smiled. Texted back a heart emoji, one of the few concessions he'd made to modern communication, and pushed his cart toward the next conference room. In a few hours, his carefully ordered world would shatter in a way he couldn't yet imagine. But for now, there was just the work, the quiet morning, and the simple satisfaction of a job done well. The morning session of the Global Economic Summit had begun in earnest by 9 o'clock, and the 8th floor hummed with the controlled chaos of important people doing important things. Evan had learned to read the rhythms of these events over his years at the Grand Belmont. The sharp click of expensive shoes on marble, the low murmur of deal-making in hallways, the particular tension that came from gatherings where billions of dollars hung on handshakes and casual conversations. He was working his way down the corridor, methodically checking that each conference room had fresh water pitchers, clean glassware, and adequate supplies. The attendees barely registered his presence, walking past him as if he were another piece of furniture. Evan had grown accustomed to this. There was almost a freedom in invisibility. No one watched you, no one judged you, no one expected anything beyond your basic function. The service room near the main elevator bank needed restocking. Evan backed out carefully, pulling his cart loaded with fresh linens and cleaning supplies, his attention focused on maneuvering the awkward load through the narrow doorway. He heard footsteps approaching, but assumed whoever it was would simply walk around him, as people usually did. He was wrong. The collision happened fast. Evan's cart clipped something solid, and he heard the sharp intake of breath, the clatter of objects hitting the floor. He turned to see a tall man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit stumbling backward, his leather briefcase knocked from his hand, papers scattering across the polished floor in a wide arc. "I'm so sorry," Evan said immediately, moving to help gather the scattered documents. "I didn't see." "You didn't see." The man's voice cut through the air like a blade. "You backed right into me, you idiot." Evan looked up and recognized Lance Caraway from the photos he'd seen in financial news. The billionaire's face was flushed with anger, his jaw clenched tight. Around them, other conference attendees had stopped to watch, a small crowd forming in the elegant hallway. "Sir, I apologize," Evan said, keeping his voice calm and respectful. He continued gathering papers, trying to restore order. "Let me help you with—" "Don't touch those!" Lance snatched the papers from Evan's hands. "Do you have any idea what these documents are worth? What they contain?" "No, sir." "I'm very sorry for the accident." "Accident?" Lance's laugh was harsh and cold. "Is that what we're calling incompetence now?" He looked around at the gathered crowd, playing to them. "This is what happens when hotels hire people who can't even push a cart without destroying property." Several people in the crowd chuckled. Evan felt heat rising in his face, but he kept his expression neutral. He'd been through worse. He just needed to get through this moment, let the man vent his anger, and move on with his day. "I'll be more careful, sir," Evan said quietly, starting to back away toward his cart. "Wait." Lance's voice stopped him. The billionaire had retrieved his coffee cup from where it had been knocked aside, a large paper cup from the hotel's premium coffee service, still 3/4 full. "You think you can just walk away? After making me look like a fool in front of my colleagues?" Evan's stomach tightened. He recognized something dangerous in Lance's tone, an edge that went beyond simple anger into something more personal, more vindictive. "Sir, I've apologized. I don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" Lance stepped closer, his voice dropping to something almost intimate in its cruelty. "You want to know about trouble? Let me show you what trouble looks like for invisible people who can't do their jobs properly." The coffee hit Evan's face in a hot, shocking wave. The liquid burned his skin, running down his cheeks and neck, soaking into his uniform. The crowd gasped, some in shock, others in something that sounded uncomfortably like laughter. Evan stood frozen, the humiliation more scalding than the coffee itself. Lance tossed the empty cup at Evan's feet. "Clean that up. It's what you're good for." The crowd parted as Lance strode away, several people following him, their voices already turning the incident into an anecdote, a funny story to share over lunch. A few others hurried past Evan without meeting his eyes, embarrassed witnesses who wanted no part of what they'd seen. Evan stood alone in the hallway, coffee dripping from his face, the smell of expensive Ethiopian roast mixing with the sharp scent of his own humiliation. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled a cleaning cloth from his cart and wiped his face. The skin of his cheeks and forehead burned, already turning red from the heat. "Evan!" Antonio's voice came from down the hall. The older man must have witnessed everything from his position near the service elevator. He approached quickly, his face tight with anger and concern. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up." "I'm fine," Evan said automatically, though his voice came out rougher than he intended. "No, you're not. Come with me." Antonio guided him to the service bathroom, a small utilitarian space that smelled of industrial soap and bleach. Evan caught sight of himself in the mirror. Coffee-stained uniform, reddened skin, eyes that looked older than they had this morning. He turned on the cold water and bent over the sink, splashing his face repeatedly, trying to wash away both the coffee and the shame. "That bastard," Antonio muttered, pacing in the small space. "I saw the whole thing. You're going to report this, right? File a complaint? What he did was assault." Evan dried his face with paper towels, wincing at the tenderness of his skin. "And then what, Antonio? The Grand Belmont fires me for causing trouble with a VIP guest. I need this job. Bridget's tuition. He threw hot coffee in your face." "I know." Evan's voice was quiet, defeated. "I know what he did." He looked at his reflection again, seeing not just the immediate damage, but all the years behind it. The educated man who'd once commanded respect in boardrooms, reduced to accepting public humiliation because he couldn't afford to fight back. The father who needed every paycheck to support his daughter's education. The widower who'd learned that dignity was sometimes a luxury you couldn't afford. "I'm going to finish my shift," Evan said finally. "Can you get me a clean uniform from the laundry?" Antonio's face showed his disappointment, but he nodded. "Yeah, I'll get you one." He paused at the door. "For what it's worth, you handled that with more class than that rich piece of garbage will ever have." After Antonio left, Evan stood alone in the bathroom, the fluorescent light humming overhead. His face throbbed. His pride felt bruised in a way that went deeper than skin. But beneath the humiliation, something else stirred, a memory of a name he'd heard years ago, in another life. Pinnacle Data Solutions. Lance Carraway's shell company network included Pinnacle. Evan was almost certain of it. He'd read about Carraway Capital's structure in financial journals back when he still followed such things, back when he'd cared about the machinery of high finance. The same company that had destroyed his career, taken his pension, left him scrambling for survival. It was part of Lance Carraway's empire. The irony was almost too perfect to be real. The man who'd just humiliated him was, indirectly, responsible for putting him in this position in the first place. Evan splashed more cold water on his face and tried to push the thought away. Knowing didn't change anything. It didn't give him power or options. It just made the burn go deeper. Evan returned to work in a fresh uniform, the coffee-stained one bundled into a plastic bag that he'd deal with later. Antonio had wanted him to take the rest of the day off, but Evan had refused. Sitting at home would just give him time to replay the humiliation in his mind, to feel the burn of those laughing faces watching his degradation. At least working gave him something concrete to focus on. He moved through his tasks with mechanical precision, avoiding the 8th floor entirely. The conference rooms on the lower levels needed attention, and he threw himself into the work, polishing brass fixtures until they gleamed, ensuring every surface was spotless, finding comfort in the simple logic of cause and effect. Apply effort, see results. It was more straightforward than anything else in his life right now. Antonio found him around 10:30, restocking supplies in a 6th-floor storage closet. The older man's expression was troubled, and he kept glancing at his phone. "You okay?" Evan asked, noting the distraction. "Something's happening," Antonio said. "Stock market's going crazy. Started about 20 minutes ago." Evan felt a distant curiosity, but nothing more. The stock market's movements had stopped mattering to him years ago, when he'd lost everything he had invested. "Rich people's problems," he said quietly. "Maybe." Antonio showed him his phone screen, though the numbers and ticker symbols meant little without context. "But the hotel staff group chat is blowing up. Something about a major financial scandal breaking." Before Evan could respond, Phyllis appeared at the end of the hallway, moving faster than her usual measured pace. Her face was flushed, and she was staring at her own phone with an expression of shock. "You two need to see this," she said, slightly breathless. She held out her phone, and Antonio and Evan crowded around to look. The screen showed a news alert. Breaking, whistleblower report exposes massive fraud at Kaew Capital. CC freezes assets, criminal charges expected. Evan felt something cold settle in his stomach. He took Phyllis's phone and began reading the article beneath the headline. The whistleblower, an unnamed former executive, had released thousands of pages of internal documents exposing a web of illegal activities. Offshore accounts hiding taxable income, insider trading schemes, shell companies used to manipulate markets and destroy competitors, systematic fraud that had netted billions over the past decade. "Lance Kaew," Phyllis said unnecessarily. "The same guy who's staying here. The one who—" She stopped, glancing at Evan with sympathy. Word had already spread about the coffee incident. Evan continued reading, his analyst's mind automatically processing the information, seeing patterns and connections that others might miss. The article mentioned several shell companies by name, entities that Kaew Capital had used to acquire and strip assets from smaller firms. Then he saw it, Pinnacle Data Solutions. The name jumped out at him like a shout in a quiet room. His hands tightened on the phone, and he had to read the paragraph 3 times to make sure he wasn't imagining it. Pinnacle Data Solutions, one of Kaew's most aggressive acquisition vehicles, specialized in hostile takeovers of mid-sized analytics firms. The company would acquire targets, extract valuable intellectual property and client lists, then systematically eliminate existing staff to maximize profit margins. Former employees describe a pattern of predatory business practices that destroyed careers while enriching Kaew personally. The storage closet suddenly felt too small. Evan handed the phone back to Phyllis, his mind racing through memories he'd tried to bury. 7 years ago, when DataCore Solutions had been acquired, the acquirer had been Pinnacle Data Solutions, a name that meant nothing to him at the time. Just another corporate entity in a landscape of mergers and consolidations. Lance Kaew had destroyed his career. Not indirectly, not through some complicated chain of corporate decisions, directly. Pinnacle was Lance's company, and the acquisition that had cost Evan everything had been orchestrated by the same man who'd thrown coffee in his face this morning. "Evan?" Antonio's voice seemed to come from far away. "You okay?" "You look pale." "I'm fine," Evan said automatically. Then more honestly, "No, I'm not fine." He told them about Pinnacle, about the acquisition that had eliminated his department, about being 43 years old with a dying wife and suddenly no income, no pension, no future in his field. He told them about the year of unemployment, the foreclosure, the desperate scramble for any work that would pay the bills. Phyllis's eyes widened with understanding and anger. "That son of a, the same company," Antonio said slowly, shaking his head. "The same man who destroyed your life threw coffee in your face this morning." The three of them stood in silence for a moment, processing the cruel symmetry of it. Evan felt something building in his chest, not quite satisfaction, not quite anger, something more complicated. Justice, perhaps, though he'd learned not to trust that word. His phone buzzed. A text from Bridget. "Dad, are you okay? There's a video going viral of some rich jerk throwing coffee at a hotel worker. People are saying it's you." Evan's stomach dropped. Of course someone had filmed it. Everyone had phones out at these events, documenting everything, turning life into content. He texted back quickly, "I'm fine. It was nothing." "Don't worry." Her response came immediately. "Nothing? Dad, I'm coming to the hotel." "No, I'm working." "I'm fine. I promise. We're talking about this tonight." Evan pocketed his phone and looked at Antonio and Phyllis. "The video's online." Phyllis was already searching, and within seconds she found it. Multiple versions had been posted to various social media platforms, each with thousands of views already. The video showed everything: Evan's apology, Lance's cruel performance for the crowd, the coffee thrown in his face, the laughter. The comments ranged from outraged to cynical, but they all agreed on one thing. It was clear evidence of casual cruelty from someone who believed his wealth put him above basic decency. "This is assault," Phyllis said firmly. "You could press charges. Especially now with all this other stuff coming out about him. What good would that do?" Evan asked. He's already facing criminal charges for fraud. My complaint would just get lost in the noise. It's not about noise, Antonio said. It's about holding him accountable for what he did to you. But Evan was thinking about something else. The news article had mentioned that the SEC was freezing Kaew Capital's assets, that criminal charges were expected within days. Lance Kaew's empire was collapsing in real time, brought down not by victims seeking revenge, but by the simple weight of his own corruption. Sometimes, Evan thought, the world had its own way of delivering justice. Not always, and often not fast enough, but occasionally the arc of consequences bent in the right direction. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a news alert. Markets in free fall as Kaew Capital scandal spreads. Billions wiped out in morning trading. Evan looked at the alert, then at his coffee-stained uniform in the plastic bag, then at his reflection in the polished brass of a nearby fixture. The same man who'd humiliated him this morning was watching his entire world crumble. Within hours, possibly minutes, Lance Kaew would go from untouchable billionaire to criminal defendant. And Evan would still be here, mopping floors and restocking conference rooms, continuing the life he'd rebuilt from nothing. Somehow, that felt like its own kind of victory. The Grand Belmont had transformed into something resembling a war zone by early afternoon, though the battles were fought with phones and laptops rather than weapons. Conference sessions had been abandoned as attendees clustered in small groups, watching market tickers on their devices, making urgent calls, their faces ranging from shocked to calculating as they tried to understand the implications of Kaew Capital's collapse. Evan was assigned to the executive floors again, though Antonio had offered to switch his assignment. Evan had declined. Running from Lance Kaew now felt like giving the man more power than he deserved. Besides, Evan was curious in a detached way, like someone watching a building burn from a safe distance. The 8th floor, Lance's territory, was in chaos. Men and women in expensive suits rushed in and out of the presidential suite. Lawyers, obviously, along with public relations people and financial advisors, all speaking in urgent, hushed tones. The door to Lance's suite stood open, and through it, Evan could hear fragments of desperate conversations. You need to get ahead of this narrative. SEC is freezing everything, including personal accounts. Criminal liability is almost certain at this point. Evan moved quietly along the hallway, replacing towels in a supply closet, his presence as invisible as always. But he listened, his analyst's mind processing the information, understanding the implications in ways these highly paid advisors might not fully grasp. The whistleblower report had been comprehensive, methodical, devastating. Whoever had compiled it knew exactly where all the bodies were buried. Through the open door, he caught glimpses of Lance pacing, phone pressed to his ear, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that looked like panic. The man's tie was loosened, his hair disheveled, his voice rising and falling with urgency. I don't care what it costs, just get it done. Those accounts were completely legal. You're my lawyer, make this go away. But some things, Evan knew, couldn't be made to go away. Not when the evidence was overwhelming, not when federal prosecutors smelled blood in the water. He continued his rounds, cleaning rooms that no one was using because everyone was too distracted by the unfolding catastrophe. Near the service elevator, he encountered Preston Vale, the hotel's general manager, speaking in low tones with someone from hotel security. Can't exactly ask him to leave, Preston was saying. He's paid through the week. Actually, sir, the security officer said, checking his tablet, his credit cards are being declined. All of them. Corporate accounts too. Preston's eyebrows rose. He can't pay? Looks like everything's frozen. The SEC moved fast. Evan paused, pretending to check his supply cart while he absorbed this information. Lance Kaew, who this morning had wielded his wealth like a weapon, couldn't even pay his hotel bill. The reversal was so complete, so sudden, that it almost didn't seem real. His phone buzzed. Bridget calling this time instead of texting. He stepped into an empty conference room to answer. "Dad," she said immediately, her voice tight with anger and concern. "I saw the video. I saw what that man did to you. I'm okay, sweetheart, really. You're not okay. He assaulted you. And Dad, her voice shifted, became more intense. I did some research. Do you know who Lance Caraway is? Do you know what his companies do? I know. He destroys people, Dad. He's made billions by... She stopped. Wait, what do you mean you know? Evan sat down in one of the conference room chairs, suddenly tired. Pinnacle Data Solutions. It's in the whistleblower report. It was one of his shell companies. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Evan thought the connection had dropped. Then Bridget spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Pinnacle. That's the company that bought Datacore. That's the company that... Yes. Oh, Dad! She was crying now. He could hear it. The man who destroyed our lives threw coffee in your face? I know, Bridget. I figured it out this morning. How are you so calm? You should be, I don't know, pressing charges, suing him something. Evan looked out the conference room window at the city skyline, the afternoon sun catching on glass, and steel towers where other fortunes were being made and lost. What would that accomplish? He's already facing criminal charges. The SEC has frozen his assets. His empire is collapsing. What more do you want? I want him to acknowledge what he did to you, to us, to Mom. The mention of Patricia hit harder than expected. Your mother wouldn't want me carrying that anger around. You know that. Bridget was quiet for a moment. I know, but I'm allowed to be angry for you, even if you won't be angry for yourself. I didn't say I'm not angry. I said revenge won't help anything. They talked for a few more minutes, Bridget eventually calming down, Evan reassuring her that he was truly okay, that this job had survived worse storms than one viral video. When they hung up, he sat alone in the empty conference room, thinking about the turns life could take, how quickly circumstances could reverse. He thought about Patricia during her illness, how she'd faced her own collapse with grace and dignity, how she'd taught him that character wasn't measured in success, but in how you handled failure, how she'd made him promise near the end that he wouldn't let bitterness consume him. Don't let what happens to you define who you are, she'd said, her voice already weak from the cancer. You're more than your job, more than your bank account. You're a good man, Evan. Stay a good man. He'd kept that promise. It hadn't been easy. There had been dark months when anger had threatened to swallow him whole, when the unfairness of everything had felt crushing. But he'd held on, rebuilt himself piece by piece, found meaning in smaller things. Being there for Bridget, showing up for work every day, treating people with respect regardless of their station. And now Lance Caraway, who'd never learned those lessons, was discovering what happened when your entire identity was built on wealth and power that could vanish overnight. Evan stood up, straightened his uniform and headed back to work. As he pushed his cart down the hallway, he passed the presidential suite again. The door was still open, and this time he saw Lance clearly, slumped in a chair, head in his hands, the picture of a man whose world had just ended. Their eyes met for a brief second. Lance's face registered recognition, then shame, then he looked away quickly. Evan continued walking, neither slowing down nor speeding up, just maintaining his steady pace. There was something profound in that moment, though Evan couldn't quite articulate it yet. Two men whose lives had intersected twice now, once when Lance had unknowingly destroyed Evan's career, and once when he'd knowingly humiliated him. And now both of them were here, in this hallway on the same floor of the same hotel, separated by nothing but circumstance and choices. Evan thought about what Bridget had said, about wanting Lance to acknowledge what he'd done. Maybe acknowledgement would come, or maybe it wouldn't. Either way, Evan would continue being the person he'd chosen to become. Someone who found dignity in honest work, who measured worth in character rather than bank accounts, who understood that revenge and justice weren't the same thing. Some lessons, he thought, you couldn't teach. People had to learn them through their own falls. 2 days had passed since the coffee incident, and the Grand Belmont felt like a different world. The economic summit had effectively dissolved, attendees cutting their stays short and fleeing back to their offices to manage the fallout from Caraway Capital's implosion. The ripple effects were spreading. Other firms with ties to Lance's network were under investigation. Market volatility had reached crisis levels, and financial news channels were running continuous coverage of what they were calling the biggest fraud scandal of the decade. Evan watched it all from his unique vantage point, moving through the hotel's spaces like a ghost, hearing conversations that people assumed were private because they didn't register his presence. He learned things that wouldn't hit the news for hours or days, which executives were panicking, which ones were quietly celebrating a competitor's downfall, which ones were checking their own practices to make sure they wouldn't be next. The 8th floor had become Lance Caraway's prison. Federal marshals had appeared yesterday afternoon, serving warrants and seizing documents, phones, laptops, anything that might contain evidence. They'd been professional but thorough, transforming the presidential suite into a crime scene. Lance had watched it all happen, his earlier bluster completely gone, replaced by the hollow-eyed shock of someone whose reality had fundamentally shifted. Preston Vale, the hotel manager, had pulled Evan aside that morning with an uncomfortable request. "I need you to be extra professional on the executive floors," Preston had said, not quite meeting Evan's eyes. "I know what happened with the coffee incident, and believe me, if it were up to me, Caraway would have been asked to leave immediately. But we're in a delicate situation here." "I understand," Evan had said simply. "Do you? Because the hotel ownership is concerned about liability. If anything happens, if there's any confrontation between you and him, it could complicate things legally for us." What Preston meant, but didn't say, don't make trouble. Don't seek revenge. Keep being invisible. Evan had nodded and returned to work, unsurprised. The hotel would protect itself first, its wealthy guests second, and its staff a distant third. That was how the world worked, and he'd long since stopped being shocked by it. But Lance's situation continued to deteriorate in ways that were almost painful to witness. Evan had seen Antonio's updates. Credit cards declined, bank accounts frozen. Calls from desperate family members and former associates, all going unanswered or rejected. The man who'd commanded rooms through sheer force of wealth and personality now couldn't even order room service. On his lunch break, Evan sat in the staff cafeteria with Antonio and Phyllis, half watching the financial news playing on the wall-mounted television. The coverage showed photos of Lance from better times, at charity galas, accepting business awards, shaking hands with politicians. The contrast with the broken man Evan had glimpsed in the hallway was stark. "They're saying he'll get at least 10 years, Antonio said, nodding toward the television. "Maybe more, depending on what else they find." "Good," Phyllis said firmly. "Man like that deserves whatever he gets." Evan picked at his sandwich, not particularly hungry. "You ever think about how fast it can all fall apart?" Antonio looked at him thoughtfully. "You mean like what happened to you?" "I mean for anyone. This morning, Lance Caraway was a billionaire. Now he's a defendant. 7 years ago, I was a respected analyst. Then I wasn't. How much of what we think is stable is really just good luck that hasn't run out yet?" "That's a dark way of looking at it," Phyllis said. "Maybe, but it's true, isn't it? We tell ourselves we're in control, that success comes from hard work and smart choices. But sometimes you do everything right and still lose everything." Antonio was quiet for a moment. "You sound like you're feeling sorry for him." "No," Evan said slowly. "Not sorry exactly. But I remember what it feels like when your world collapses, the disorientation, the way everyone looks at you differently, how fast people disappear from your life." "He brought it on himself," Phyllis insisted. "You didn't. You lost your job because of corporate greed. He's losing everything because he broke the law." "That's true," Evan acknowledged. "But pain is still pain, deserved or not." The conversation shifted to other topics. But Evan's thoughts remained on Lance. He'd observed the man over the past 2 days, noting the subtle changes, the way Lance flinched when his phone rang, the defeated slope of his shoulders, the growing desperation in his voice during calls with his lawyers. What struck Evan most was the isolation. Lance's entourage had melted away within hours of the scandal breaking. The people who'd laughed at his cruel jokes, who'd competed for his attention, who'd treated him like royalty, all gone. The man was alone in a way that went beyond physical solitude. That evening, Evan was restocking supplies on the 8th floor when he heard raised voices from Lance's suite. The door was cracked open, and he could see Lance arguing with a well-dressed woman who was probably another lawyer. "No one is willing to post bail," she was saying, her tone professional but firm. "Your assets are frozen, your family won't return my calls, and frankly, Mr. Carraway, you're considered a flight risk." "I have nowhere to go." Lance's voice cracked. "Everything I own is tied up in, I'm aware. That's why the court won't grant bail. You'll likely be taken into custody within the next 48 hours. Can't you?" Lance stopped, seemed to deflate. "Never mind. Just go." The lawyer gathered her briefcase and left, passing Evan in the hallway without acknowledgement. Through the open door, Evan could see Lance standing at the window, staring out at the city. The man looked smaller somehow, diminished not in size but in presence. Evan continued his work, moving down the hallway to check smoke detectors and replace air freshener cartridges. He tried not to think about Lance, tried to maintain the professional distance that the job required. But he kept remembering Patricia's words from her final weeks. Everyone deserves compassion, even the people who don't deserve compassion. That's what makes us human. His phone buzzed. A text from Bridget. "Want company for dinner? I can bring takeout. That would be nice. Home by 6. He finished his shift methodically, checking every item off his task list, ensuring everything was properly stocked for the night crew. As he was heading toward the service elevator, he passed Lance's suite one more time. The door was fully open now, and Lance sat on the sofa, surrounded by cardboard boxes that the federal marshals had left behind. His expensive suit was rumpled, his face unshaven, and he was staring at a piece of paper, probably some legal document, with an expression of complete defeat. He looked up and saw Evan standing in the doorway. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Evan saw recognition in Lance's eyes, and something else, shame maybe, or regret. The coffee incident hung between them, unacknowledged but present. Lance opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. What could he say? Zari seemed inadequate. Any explanation would sound like an excuse. Evan nodded slightly, a gesture that wasn't quite acknowledgement and wasn't quite forgiveness, then continued to the elevator. Some conversations, he thought, happened without words. The next morning was Evan's scheduled day off, and he woke without an alarm, the luxury of sleeping until 6:30, feeling almost decadent. Bridget had stayed over, sleeping on the couch after their dinner the previous night. They'd talked for hours about everything and nothing, her graduate program, her anxieties about the job market, whether she should apply for positions here or consider moving to another city for better opportunities. Evan had listened mostly, offering guidance when asked, proud of the thoughtful, principled young woman she'd become. She'd inherited Patricia's sharp mind and his own tendency toward careful analysis. But she had something neither of them possessed, an unshakable belief that the world could be made more just, more equitable, if enough people tried hard enough. He made coffee quietly, not wanting to wake her, and took his cup to the small balcony that overlooked the street. The morning was cool and clear, the city stirring to life below. From here, he couldn't see the Grand Belmont, but he thought about it anyway, wondered if Lance was awake in his suite, staring at his own uncertain future. Evan had been thinking about Patricia a lot these past few days. Not the sick Patricia of those final months, but the vibrant woman he'd married, the one who'd challenged him to be better than he thought he could be. She'd been a social worker, spent her career helping people navigate systems designed more to exclude than include. She'd seen the worst of human behavior, but somehow maintained faith in human potential. He remembered a conversation from years ago, before either of them could have imagined how their lives would change. They'd been watching news coverage of some corporate scandal, executives being led away in handcuffs, and Patricia had said something that stuck with him. Those men probably started out wanting to do good. Somewhere along the way, they convinced themselves that the rules didn't apply to them. That's the real tragedy. Not that they fell, but that they forgot who they were supposed to be. Was that what had happened to Lance? Had he started out as someone different, someone better, before wealth and power eroded whatever moral foundation he'd once possessed? The door opened behind him, and Bridget emerged, wrapped in a blanket, her hair disheveled from sleep. "Morning, Dad," she said, settling into the other chair with her own cup of coffee. "You're thinking too hard. I can tell, just reflecting. About him. The coffee guy?" Evan smiled slightly at the nickname. "Among other things." "I've been reading about him," Bridget said. "Not just the scandal stuff, his background. Did you know he grew up poor? Like, really poor. His dad was a mechanic, his mom cleaned houses. He put himself through community college, then transferred to a state university. Worked 3 jobs to pay for it. I didn't know that. Makes you think, doesn't it? He clawed his way up from nothing just like you did. But he went the other direction. Stepped on people to get higher instead of lifting people up." Evan considered this. "Success changes people. Sometimes it shows you who they really are. Sometimes it makes them forget. Which do you think happened with him?" "I don't know. Maybe both." Evan sipped his coffee, watching a bus rumble past on the street below. "When I lost my job, I had you and your mother. I had a reason to keep going that was bigger than myself. Maybe Lance never had that. Maybe success became the only thing he had to hold on to, and he'd do anything to keep it. That doesn't excuse what he did to you, to all those other people. No, it doesn't, but understanding isn't the same as excusing." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the way only family can. No pressure to fill the quiet with unnecessary words. Eventually Bridget spoke again, her voice softer. "I've been thinking about Mom a lot lately. What she'd say about all this. She'd probably tell me to forgive him. Would you? Could you?" Evan thought about the question seriously. "I don't know if forgiveness is something you decide to do, or something that happens to you over time. What I do know is that carrying anger hasn't helped me. It didn't change what happened to us. It didn't bring your mother back, or restore my career. All it did was make me heavier. So you just let it go? Let him off the hook?" "He's not off the hook. The law is taking care of that. But what he did to me, to us, I can't keep holding on to it. It's like drinking poison and waiting for him to die." Bridget smiled slightly. "Mom used to say that. I know. She was right about most things." They spent the rest of the morning together, making breakfast, talking about lighter topics, pretending for a few hours that the world was simpler than it was. Eventually, Bridget had to leave for an afternoon class, and Evan was left alone with his thoughts again. He walked to the cemetery, something he did on most of his days off. Patricia was buried in a modest plot in a well-maintained municipal cemetery. Her headstone simple granite with her name, dates, and the line she'd chosen herself. She helped people find their way. Evan sat on the bench near her grave, as he always did, and talked to her as if she could hear him. "I don't know what to do about this situation," he admitted. "Part of me wants to just ignore it, let justice run its course, move on with my life. But another part keeps thinking that maybe there's something more here, some lesson I'm supposed to learn or teach." The breeze rustled through the trees overhead, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass. Evan closed his eyes and tried to imagine what Patricia would say. She'd probably ask him questions instead of giving answers. That had been her way. She'd push him to examine his own motivations, to think beyond his immediate feelings to what kind of person he wanted to be. "You told me not to let bitterness take root," he said aloud. "But what about justice? What about accountability? Where's the line between forgiveness and allowing bad behavior to continue?" No answer came, of course. The dead kept their wisdom to themselves. But sitting there, in the peaceful silence of the cemetery, Evan felt something shift in his thinking. Patricia hadn't told him not to seek justice. She told him not to let bitterness consume him. Those were different things. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration, about making things right where possible, about ensuring that harm wasn't repeated. And sometimes justice required confrontation rather than silence. He thought about Lance in that hotel suite, isolated and broken, facing the consequences of years of choices that had hurt countless people. The legal system would punish him, yes, but would it teach him anything? Would he emerge from prison understanding the human cost of his actions, or would he just be bitter about getting caught? Evan didn't have answers, but he was beginning to think that maybe, just maybe, there was something he could offer that the legal system couldn't. Not forgiveness exactly, and certainly not absolution, but perhaps something else. A mirror held up to show Lance who he'd become, and who he still might choose to be. The question was whether Lance was capable of looking. Evan returned to work the following day to find the Grand Belmont in a state of subdued chaos. Preston Vale was in the lobby, speaking tersely with hotel security, while several federal marshals stood nearby, their presence turning heads among the remaining guests. The economic summit was officially over, but its aftermath lingered like smoke after a fire. Antonio caught Evan in the service hallway before his shift officially began. "They're evicting him today," Antonio said quietly. "Caraway. Hotel can't keep carrying the unpaid bills, and the feds want him out anyway. They're taking him into custody this afternoon." Evan nodded, feeling a strange mixture of emotions he couldn't quite name. "Where will they take him?" "Federal holding facility, probably." "Until the arraignment." Antonio studied Evan's face. "You okay with working the 8th floor today? I can reassign you if—" "I'm fine," Evan said. "It's just another day," but it wasn't, and they both knew it. The 8th floor was quieter than it had been in days. The lawyers and advisors had stopped coming, their work either finished or abandoned. Through the open door of the presidential suite, Evan could see Lance packing his belongings into a single cardboard box, all that remained of a life that had once required multiple assistants to manage. Evan went about his duties, replacing linens in the nearby suites, checking that conference rooms were properly cleaned. He tried not to think about Lance, tried to maintain the professional distance that had served him well for 7 years. But his mind kept returning to what Bridget had told him about Lance's poor background, about the 3 jobs to pay for college, a man who'd started from nothing, just like Evan. 2 parallel journeys that had diverged somewhere along the way. Around noon, Evan was taking out trash near the service elevator when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to find Lance Caraway standing in the hallway, carrying his box, escorted by 2 federal marshals in plain clothes. The contrast between this Lance and the one who'd thrown coffee 3 days ago was almost shocking. The expensive suit replaced by rumpled casual clothes, the confident bearing gone, replaced by something that looked like shell shock. The marshals were guiding Lance toward the back exit, the service entrance that hotel staff used, the same route Evan took every day. The final indignity, leaving through the door reserved for people the hotel would rather keep invisible. They passed within a few feet of each other. Lance's eyes met Evan's. And in that moment something passed between them, recognition certainly, but also a strange kind of understanding. They were in this moment on the same level, both using the service entrance, both treated as less than the wealthy guests in the marble lobby. The marshals led Lance past, and Evan watched them go, his hand still on his trash cart. He should have felt satisfaction watching the man who'd humiliated him being led away like a common criminal. But instead, he felt only a hollow sadness for all the waste, wasted potential, wasted lives, wasted opportunities to be better. Evan was about to return to work when he heard Lance's voice. "Wait!" The marshal stopped, turning back with professional patience. Lance was looking at Evan, his face a mixture of emotions, shame, fear, and something else that might have been desperate courage. "I owe you an apology," Lance said. His voice was rough, lacking the polished confidence Evan had heard in the hallway 3 days ago. "For the coffee." He stopped, seemed to struggle with words. "For everything," one of the marshals shifted impatiently. "Mr. Caraway, we need to move. Just a moment, please." Lance took a step toward Evan, and the marshals allowed it, though they remained alert. "I don't expect you to accept it, but I need to say it. I'm sorry." Evan looked at this broken man, this shadow of arrogance, and felt something unexpected, a kind of clarity. He could see the whole pattern now, the way wealth and power had corrupted whatever good might have once existed in Lance Caraway, the way losing everything had stripped away the mask and revealed the frightened, hollow person underneath. "I know who you are," Evan said quietly. The marshals were listening, but he didn't care. This moment had been coming since the coffee hit his face, maybe longer. "I know what you did." Lance's face showed confusion. You mean the coffee?" "No, before that. 7 years ago." Evan kept his voice calm, conversational. "I worked at Data Core Solutions, senior data analyst. I designed risk assessment models for financial services firms. Then Pinnacle Data Solutions acquired us. Do you remember Pinnacle, Mr. Caraway?" The confusion on Lance's face slowly gave way to horror as understanding dawned. That was one of your shell companies, yes. The acquisition was hostile. My entire department was eliminated within 6 months. Pension lost. 43 years old, wife dying of cancer, daughter in college. Lost our house. Lost our savings. Lost everything. Evan paused, letting the words settle. "You destroyed my career, Mr. Caraway. Destroyed my life. And you never even knew my name." Lance's face had gone pale. The box in his hands trembled slightly. I never thought about." "No, you didn't think about it. That's the point, isn't it? Hundreds of careers destroyed, maybe thousands. And you never thought about the actual people behind the numbers. We were just line items on a spreadsheet. Expenses to be eliminated. Obstacles to profit." One of the marshals cleared his throat. "Sir, we really need to—" "I'm the one who designed the algorithm your company still uses," Evan continued, his voice still calm but carrying an edge now. "The risk assessment model that made Caraway Capital billions. You bought my work, destroyed my life, and built your empire on algorithms I created. And this morning," he gestured toward the service elevator, "this morning, the man who did all that threw coffee in my face and humiliated me in front of a crowd because I accidentally bumped into him." Lance set down his box, seemed to need both hands free to steady himself. "I don't know what to say." "I can't. There's no apology that could—" "No, there isn't," Evan agreed. "But here's what's interesting, Mr. Caraway. I could hate you. Part of me wants to. Part of me has wanted to for 7 years, ever since I connected Pinnacle to your network. But you know what I've learned? Hate doesn't change anything. It just makes you heavy. So what do you want from me?" Evan considered the question. What did he want? Revenge? He was already getting that. Lance's empire had crumbled. His freedom was about to be taken away, his reputation destroyed. Justice? The legal system was handling that. So what was left? "I want you to understand," Evan said finally. "I want you to know that every decision you made, every company you gutted, every career you destroyed, those were real people, with families, with dreams, with dignity. I want you to know that it mattered." Lance's eyes were wet now. "I know. I'm starting to understand that. Too late, but I understand." The marshals were getting insistent. Lance picked up his box again, but before they could lead him away, he turned back to Evan one more time. "The legal charges," he said. "The technical details of the shell companies and offshore accounts. I don't fully understand them. My lawyers are—" He stopped, laughed bitterly. "My lawyers have mostly abandoned me, but I need to understand what I did. Really understand it. So I can—" His voice broke. "So I can try to make it right somehow." Evan pulled out his wallet, removed an old business card from the days when he'd been someone who carried business cards. He crossed out the old information and wrote his cell phone number on the back. "Call me," he said, handing it to Lance. "I'll explain it to you once." Lance stared at the card like it was a lifeline. "Why would you help me?" "Because someone helped me when I had nothing," Evan said. "And because understanding is the first step toward becoming better than you were." Lance called 2 days later. Evan had just finished his shift and was waiting for the bus when his phone rang with an unfamiliar number. He almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers usually meant spam or wrong numbers, but something made him pick up. "Mr. Pike?" Lance's voice was hesitant, stripped of the command it had once carried. "This is Lance Caraway. You said I could call." "I remember. They've released me on house arrest. Electronic monitoring. My lawyer managed to convince the judge I wasn't a flight risk, since I have nowhere to go and no money to get there." The bitter humor in his voice was self-aware in a way Evan hadn't expected. "I'm in a friend's guest house." "Well, former friend." "He wouldn't take my calls, but his wife felt sorry for me." Evan waited, letting Lance work through whatever he needed to say. The SEC complaint, Lance continued. It's 300 pages of financial structures and legal language. My lawyers keep explaining it, but they're trying to find loopholes, ways to minimize my liability. I don't want that. I want to understand what I actually did, what it meant. Where are you? Lance gave him an address in a neighborhood Evan vaguely knew. Expensive homes, tree-lined streets, the kind of place he'd driven through but never imagined living in. They agreed to meet the following afternoon, Evan's next day off. That evening, Bridget called while he was making dinner. Dad, I heard through the university grapevine that Caraway made bail. Are you okay? I'm fine. Actually, I'm meeting with him tomorrow. The silence on the other end was heavy with disbelief. You're what? He wants to understand the charges against him. The technical details. I'm going to explain them. Dad. Bridget's voice carried the particular tone of an adult child who thinks their parent is making a terrible decision. Why would you do that? Why would you help him? Evan sat down at his small kitchen table, choosing his words carefully. Because your mother would want me to. Because understanding might lead to real change. Because, he paused, because I think maybe this is how healing happens. Not through revenge, but through truth. He doesn't deserve your help. Probably not. But that's not really the point, is it? They talked for another hour. Bridget working through her anger and confusion, Evan explaining his reasoning in the patient way he'd learned from years of being her father. Eventually she sighed. I don't understand it, but I trust you. Just be careful, okay? Don't let him manipulate you. I won't. The next day, Evan took 2 buses to reach the address Lance had given him. The guest house sat behind a main residence that looked like something from an architecture magazine, all clean lines and expensive landscaping. The guest house itself was modest by comparison, though it was probably larger than Evan's entire apartment. Lance answered the door immediately, as if he'd been watching for Evan's arrival. He looked worse than he had at the hotel, thinner, with dark circles under his eyes, wearing jeans and a t-shirt that hung loose on his frame. The electronic monitoring bracelet on his ankle was visible beneath his pant leg. "Thank you for coming," Lance said, stepping aside to let Evan enter. "I wasn't sure you would." The guest house was sparsely furnished, a couch, a table, basic kitchen equipment. On the table sat a laptop, printed copies of the SEC complaint, and several legal pads covered with Lance's handwriting. "Coffee?" Lance asked, then winced. "Sorry, I didn't think about—" "Coffee's fine," Evan said evenly. They sat at the table, and Lance pushed the printed complaint toward Evan. "I've read it a dozen times. I understand the legal language, more or less. But I don't understand how it all worked, how the money moved, how the shell companies functioned. My lawyers say it's not necessary for me to understand. They just need me to cooperate with the prosecutors. But you want to understand anyway. I need to." Lance's hands were shaking slightly as he poured coffee. "I spent 20 years building this empire, and I don't actually understand what I built." "How insane is that?" Evan opened the document and began reading through it with his analyst's eye, seeing patterns and connections that would be invisible to someone without his background. After a few minutes, he pulled a legal pad toward him and began drawing diagrams. "The shell company structure works like this," he said, sketching boxes and arrows. "You set up Company A in the Cayman Islands. It exists only on paper, no employees, no office, just a registration. Company A owns Company B in Delaware. Company B owns Company C in Switzerland. Each layer adds complexity and makes the money trail harder to follow." Lance leaned forward, watching intently as Evan worked. "But why so many layers?" "Plausible deniability, tax avoidance, hiding beneficial ownership. If someone investigates Company A, they find it's owned by Company B. They investigate Company B, it's owned by Company C. By the time they trace it back to you, the trail is so complicated that proving intent becomes difficult. Until it doesn't," Lance said quietly. "Until someone on the inside decides to cooperate with investigators. Then the whole structure collapses because they have the map." Evan flipped through more pages. "Pinnacle Data Solutions was particularly interesting. You used it specifically for hostile acquisitions of analytics firms." Lance's face tightened. "Tell me about that one. Tell me what I did to your company." Evan laid it out methodically, explaining how Pinnacle had targeted data core solutions not for its client base or its employees, but purely for its intellectual property, specifically the risk assessment algorithms that Evan and his team had spent years developing. The acquisition had been structured to minimize costs, which meant eliminating the expensive human capital that had created the value in the first place. "You bought our work and threw away the workers," Evan said. "Made perfect sense from a purely profit-driven perspective. Maximized your return on investment, but destroyed lives in the process." "Yes." Lance was quiet for a long moment, staring at the diagrams Evan had drawn. "How many companies? Total." In the complaint, they list dozens of shell companies, but how many actual businesses did I destroy? Evan flipped through the document, counting. "Based on what's documented here, at least 87 companies. Probably more that aren't listed if we assume an average of 30 employees per company, though some were larger, over 2,000 people." Lance finished, his voice hollow. 2,000 families, like yours, at minimum, and I never knew their names, never thought about them. Lance stood up abruptly, walked to the window, his back to Evan. "I had a philosophy. I told myself that business was business, that it wasn't personal, that if I didn't do it, someone else would, that I was just playing by the rules of the game, the rules you helped create." "Yes." Lance turned back, his face twisted with something that might have been anguish. "I lobbied for deregulation, funded politicians who would relax oversight, hired lawyers to find loopholes and accountants to exploit them. I didn't just play the game, I rigged it." Evan watched this man unravel, seeing the dawning comprehension of harm done. It was painful to witness, but also necessary. Understanding had to come before change was possible. They spent the next 3 hours going through the complaint page by page, Evan explaining each structure, each scheme, each mechanism of fraud. Lance took notes compulsively, asking questions that showed he was really trying to grasp not just the mechanics, but the implications. "What happens to the people now?" Lance asked finally. "The ones I hurt. Can anything be done?" "The prosecutors are pushing for a victim compensation fund," Evan said. "Part of your plea agreement will likely include liquidating personal assets to provide some restitution. It won't be enough. It can't ever be enough." "No," Evan agreed. "But it's something. It's acknowledgement that harm was done and needs to be addressed." Lance looked at him with something like wonder. "Why are you helping me? Really? After everything I did to you, everything I took from you, why?" Evan thought about Patricia, about the cemetery conversations, about the man he'd chosen to become after losing everything. "Because someone showed me grace when I needed it," he said. "Antonio gave me a job when I was desperate. Phyllis covered for me when my daughter was sick. Bridget forgave me for not being the father I'd planned to be. We survive through helping each other, even when it doesn't make logical sense." "I never learned that," Lance said softly. "I thought success meant not needing anyone. That's the loneliest kind of success." 3 days after their meeting, Lance's lawyer called Evan with an unexpected request. The prosecution had agreed to a deal: full cooperation, complete disclosure, and a public statement outlining the mechanisms of fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence. But Lance had added a condition that surprised everyone. He wanted to hold a press conference to personally acknowledge his crimes and name every company he'd destroyed. "His legal team is fighting him on this," the lawyer explained. "But he's insisting. He asked if you'd be willing to attend. He says you helped him understand what he needs to say." Evan found himself in the back of a hotel conference room 2 days later, watching as journalists, former investors, and federal prosecutors filed in. The atmosphere was tense, anticipatory. Public confessions of this magnitude were rare in the world of white-collar crime. Most defendants hid behind lawyers and carefully worded statements that admitted nothing. Lance entered through a side door, flanked by his remaining attorney. He looked nervous but determined, wearing a simple dark suit, his face showing the weight of what he was about to do. He didn't look toward the back of the room where Evan stood, but somehow Evan knew Lance was aware of his presence. The room fell silent as Lance approached the podium. He adjusted the microphone, took a breath, and began. "My name is Lance Caraway, and I've spent the last 20 years building an empire on fraud, deception, and the deliberate destruction of other people's lives." The room erupted with the click and flash of cameras. Reporters leaned forward, sensing something unprecedented. "I'm not here to make excuses or to minimize what I've done," Lance continued, his voice steady despite the trembling of his hands. "I'm here to tell you the truth about how my company operated and to name the people and businesses I hurt." He pulled out a prepared statement, but then set it aside. "I was going to read from notes, but that feels like hiding. You deserve the unvarnished truth." For the next 20 minutes, Lance methodically detailed the shell company structures, the offshore accounts, the mechanisms of fraud that had enriched him while destroying others. He named companies, Data Core Solutions among them, and explained exactly how each acquisition had been structured to extract value while eliminating the people who'd created that value. "I told myself it was just business," Lance said, his voice cracking slightly. "That if I didn't do it, someone else would. That I was playing by the rules of the game. But I was lying to myself. I helped write those rules. I lobbied for deregulation. I funded politicians who would look the other way. I didn't just participate in a broken system. I broke it deliberately to benefit myself." A reporter shouted a question, but Lance held up his hand. "I'll take questions, but let me finish. I need to say something about accountability." He paused, gathering himself. "A few days ago, I met with one of the people whose life I destroyed. He worked at a company I acquired 7 years ago. I eliminated his department, took his pension, destroyed his career. He was 43, with a dying wife and a daughter in college. Because of my decisions, he lost his home, his savings, everything." Evan felt the attention in the room shift slightly, people wondering who Lance was talking about. "Last week I threw hot coffee in that man's face," Lance continued, and the room exploded with murmurs. "The viral video had been seen by millions. I humiliated him publicly because he accidentally bumped into me. I treated him like he was invisible, like he didn't matter. And I did it without knowing that I had already destroyed his life years before." Lance's eyes found Evan in the back of the room. "That man chose to help me anyway. He helped me understand the technical details of the crimes I committed, not so I could escape justice, but so I could truly comprehend the harm I'd done. He showed me that dignity isn't something you earn through wealth or success. It's something you choose every day in how you treat other people." The room had gone completely silent now. "I'm pleading guilty to all charges," Lance said. "I'm waiving my right to appeal. I'm cooperating fully with prosecutors to help them investigate similar schemes at other firms. And I'm establishing a victim compensation fund using every personal asset I have. It won't be enough. It can't ever be enough, but it's a start." Questions erupted from the reporters, a cacophony of voices demanding details, asking about specific accusations, pressing for more information. Lance answered each one honestly, not hiding behind legal language or corporate doublespeak. He named names, admitted to practices that would likely add years to his sentence, refused to deflect or minimize. One reporter asked the question Evan had been expecting: "What changed your mind? What made you decide to cooperate so completely?" Lance was quiet for a moment, considering. "I met someone who had every reason to hate me and chose compassion instead. He showed me there's another way to be human. That character isn't about success or wealth. It's about how we respond when we have the power to harm or help. I spent 20 years choosing harm. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to choose differently." The press conference lasted another 30 minutes, but Evans slipped out before it ended. He'd heard what he needed to hear, seen what he'd come to see. Lance's transformation might not be complete. Real change took years, not days, but it had begun. The acknowledgement of harm, the acceptance of consequences, the commitment to do better, those were the necessary first steps. His phone buzzed with a text from Bridget, watching the press conference. "I can't believe what he's saying." "I can't believe you helped him say it," Evan texted back. "Sometimes the hardest thing is also the right thing. Mom would be proud of you." Those words hit harder than Evan expected. He stood in the hotel hallway, blinking back unexpected tears, thinking about Patricia and the lessons she'd taught him about grace and forgiveness and the long, difficult work of remaining human in a world that often rewarded cruelty. Lance emerged from the conference room 20 minutes later, surrounded by lawyers and federal agents. He saw Evan waiting and stopped, despite the objections of his handlers. "Thank you," Lance said simply. "Don't thank me yet," Evan replied. "The hard part comes next, living with what you've learned." "I know." Lance glanced at the agents, waiting to escort him away. "But at least now I know what I need to live with. That's something." They shook hands. Two men who'd started from similar places and taken radically different paths, now meeting again at a crossroads neither could have imagined. The press conference became national news within hours. Clips played on every financial channel, the story trending across social media, legal experts analyzing Lance's unprecedented admission of guilt. The consensus was clear. This level of public accountability was almost unheard of in corporate fraud cases. Evan returned to work the next day to find himself something he'd never wanted to be: visible. "That was you," Phyllis said when she saw him in the break room. "The man he talked about in the press conference. The one whose life he destroyed." Word had spread through the hotel staff overnight. People looked at Evan differently now, not with pity, but with a kind of respect that made him uncomfortable. Antonio clapped him on the shoulder, his eyes bright with emotion he didn't try to hide. "You helped him do the right thing," Antonio said. "After everything he did to you." "I helped him understand what he did," Evan corrected. "He chose to do the right thing." That was his decision, but the attention continued. News reporters called the hotel, asking for interviews. Evan's old business card photo from Datacore Solutions appeared in articles about the Caraway scandal, identifying him as the maintenance worker whose compassion sparked a billionaire's confession. The viral video of the coffee incident was replayed endlessly, now contextualized with the fuller story. Bridget drove in that evening, bringing dinner and sitting with him in his small apartment while they watched the news coverage together. "They're calling you a hero," she said, gesturing at the television where a commentator was praising Evan's extraordinary grace under pressure. "I'm not a hero. I just talked to him." "You did more than talk, Dad. You showed him another way." "That matters." The real impact became clear over the following weeks. Lance's cooperation led to a broader investigation of industry practices. Though the firms came under scrutiny, their own shell company networks exposed. Reforms were proposed: stronger regulations, better oversight, protection for whistleblowers. The conversation had shifted from individual criminality to systemic problems. And then the letter arrived. It came in a plain envelope, forwarded through Lance's lawyer to Evan's home address. Inside was a handwritten note on simple paper, no expensive letterhead, no corporate branding, just Lance's careful script. "Dear Evan," it began, "I'm writing from the federal holding facility where I'm awaiting sentencing. My lawyer says I'm looking at 5 to 7 years, possibly more. I've accepted this. I need to face the consequences of what I've done. But I wanted you to know what's happened since the press conference. The Victim Compensation Fund is being established. My remaining assets, the ones not seized by the government, are being liquidated. It won't fully compensate everyone I hurt, but it's something. My lawyer estimates you'll receive approximately 40% of what you lost in pension and salary. Not full restitution, but acknowledgement. More importantly, the prosecutors have asked me to work with them on a broader investigation. They want to use my knowledge of industry practices to identify and stop similar schemes at other firms. I've agreed. It's the least I can do. I've also started teaching here, helping other inmates understand financial literacy, how to avoid predatory lending, how to build credit responsibly. It's strange to be on this side of it, trying to help people protect themselves from people like I used to be. But it feels right. It feels like maybe I'm finally doing something that matters. I think about that moment in the hallway a lot. When you could have walked away, could have laughed at my downfall, could have done nothing. Instead, you offered help. You showed me that grace isn't about deserving it. It's about choosing to give it anyway. I can't undo the harm I've caused. I can't give you back the years you lost or bring back your wife or restore what should have been. But I can try to be better than I was. I can try to help others avoid becoming what I became. I can spend whatever time I have left trying to add something good to the world, instead of just taking from it. Thank you for seeing me as a human being when I had stopped seeing others that way. Thank you for the mirror you held up, even when it was painful to look. Thank you for choosing compassion when you had every right to choose anger. I'm going to try to deserve it. Not for you, I understand that ship has sailed, but for myself and for everyone whose lives I can still touch in a positive way. With gratitude and respect, Lance. Evan read the letter twice, then set it on his kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. Bridget picked it up, read it silently, then looked at her father with tears in her eyes. He's really changed, she said softly. Maybe, or maybe he's just beginning to change. Real transformation takes years, not weeks. But you believe he means it. Evan thought about the man in the guest house, struggling to understand the harm he'd caused. About the press conference, where Lance had stripped away every defense and stood naked before his accusers. About the choice to cooperate fully, to teach others, to try to make amends even when it couldn't be enough. I believe he wants to mean it, Evan said. I believe he's trying. Whether he succeeds or not, that's up to him. But the trying matters. News came a week later that Lance had been sentenced to 5 years in federal prison with credit for cooperation. The Victim Compensation Fund had been approved, with disbursements beginning within 90 days. Evan would receive a check for $38,000. Not everything he'd lost, but enough to ease the financial pressure that had defined his life for 7 years. More than the money, though, there was something else. A sense that the story had found its proper ending, not in revenge or bitterness, but in the harder work of understanding, accountability, and the possibility of redemption. Patricia would have approved, Evan thought. She'd always believed in second chances, in the power of grace to transform even the hardest hearts. 6 months had passed since the press conference, and the Grand Belmont had returned to its usual rhythm, wealthy guests coming and going, conferences filling the ballrooms, the invisible machinery of service work continuing without interruption. But Evan's life had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. He still worked at the hotel, but only part-time now. 3 days a week. He arrived at 4:30 in the morning, put on his maintenance uniform, and moved through the familiar spaces with the same careful attention to detail. The other 3 days, he wore business casual clothes and took the bus to a downtown office building where the Financial Crimes Task Force had set up operations. The consulting work had started simply enough. Prosecutors needed someone who could explain complex financial structures to juries in plain language. Evan's background as an analyst, combined with his ability to break down complicated concepts, made him valuable. The work paid modestly but fairly, and more importantly, it meant something. He was helping protect others from the kind of predatory practices that had destroyed his own career. "You're good at this," Special Agent Victoria Chen had told him after his first expert testimony. "Have you considered doing it full-time?" Evan had smiled and shaken his head. "I like the balance. The hotel work keeps me grounded, reminds me where I've been." The compensation fund check had arrived 3 months ago. $38,000 deposited into his account, the largest sum he'd seen since before Patricia's illness. He'd paid down debt, set aside money for emergencies, and donated $5,000 to a non-profit that helped displaced workers retrain for new careers. The rest he'd saved, a cushion against future uncertainty. Bridget had graduated the previous month, her master's degree in public administration complete. She'd accepted a position with a workers' rights organization, helping people navigate unemployment benefits, fight wrongful termination, and understand their legal protections. Evan had attended her graduation ceremony, bursting with pride as she walked across the stage, thinking about how Patricia would have glowed with joy. "I learned from the best," Bridget had told him afterward, hugging him tight. You showed me that dignity isn't something that can be taken away. It's something you carry with you. No matter what, Lance's letters arrived monthly now, always handwritten, always honest about the difficulties of prison life and the ongoing work of transformation. He wrote about the financial literacy classes he taught, about helping other inmates prepare for release, about the slow process of understanding the full weight of his actions. Evan replied occasionally, brief notes of encouragement, never promising more than he could give. The broader investigation that Lance's cooperation had sparked was still ongoing. Several other executives had been indicted. Regulatory reforms were working through Congress, and the conversation about corporate accountability had shifted in meaningful ways. Evan knew that systems changed slowly, that one scandal wouldn't fix everything. But it was movement in the right direction. On a Thursday morning, Evan's day off, he took the bus to the cemetery, as he did most weeks. The weather was clear and cool, early autumn touching the leaves with gold. He sat on his usual bench near Patricia's grave and talked to her about everything that had happened. "I think you'd be pleased," he said aloud, not caring if anyone heard. "Not that Lance went to prison, you never took joy in other people's suffering, but that he's trying to do better, that maybe some good came from all of it." A breeze rustled through the trees, and Evan closed his eyes, remembering Patricia's voice, her laugh, the way she'd always pushed him to be the best version of himself. "Bridget's doing good work. The kind of work you did, helping people find their way through broken systems. She's got your heart for justice, and your belief that people matter more than profit." He sat in silence for a while, thinking about the strange path that had led him here. 7 years ago, he'd lost everything. 7 days ago, no, that wasn't right. 7 months ago, he'd been humiliated by a man who'd already destroyed his life once. And now he was whole again, not because he'd recovered everything he'd lost, but because he'd learned what actually mattered. That afternoon, Evan returned to the Grand Belmont for his shift. Antonio was retiring at the end of the month, and there was talk of promoting Evan to assistant maintenance supervisor. He hadn't decided yet whether to accept. The position would mean more responsibility, better pay, but less time for the consulting work. It was a good problem to have. Choices, options, the luxury of deciding rather than just surviving. He was training a new maintenance worker that day, a 48-year-old woman named Sylvia, who'd lost her corporate position during the last round of layoffs. She moved through the tasks with the careful attention of someone still adjusting to the work, still processing the fall from where she'd been. "It gets easier," Evan told her during their break. "Not the work itself, but the feeling that you've lost yourself. You haven't. This is just another chapter." Sylvia's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I keep thinking about my old office, my old title. Everything I used to be." "You're still that person," Evan said gently. "The work doesn't define you. What defines you is how you treat people, how you show up, what you choose to do with whatever circumstances you're given." Later that evening, as his shift ended and he headed toward the service exit, Evan paused in the hallway where Lance had thrown the coffee. The carpet had been cleaned, the incident forgotten by everyone except those who'd lived it. But standing there, Evan could remember it clearly. The burn of the liquid, the sound of laughter, the crushing weight of humiliation. He remembered, but it no longer hurt. The memory had transformed into something else. Not quite gratitude, because he wouldn't wish that experience on anyone, but a kind of recognition that everything had led him here, to this moment, to this life, to this understanding of who he was and who he'd chosen to become. Evan walked out into the evening air, his head high, no longer invisible to himself. The past 7 years had taken him from success to failure, to something better than either, a hard-won wisdom about what it meant to be human, to suffer, to endure, and ultimately to choose grace over bitterness. He thought about Lance in prison, trying to become better, about Bridget starting her career helping others, about Antonio retiring after decades of honest work, about Sylvia learning that dignity wasn't tied to job titles, about all the invisible people doing essential work, carrying their own stories of loss and resilience. And he thought about Patricia's voice, almost as clear as if she were walking beside him. Character is what we do when we have every right to do wrong. Evan boarded his bus home, tired but content, ready for whatever chapter came next.